Welcome back. We continue with session 12, community engagement in the context of ever-increasing humanitarian crisis and global divides. In a world facing escalating conflict, displacement, and climate disasters, strengthening local communities and fostering resilience are critical components of humanitarian response efforts. This session is hosted by MEDAIR and explores best practices for community engagement in humanitarian settings, emphasizing the role of local leadership and inclusive approaches in crisis response and recovery. Please welcome our moderator, Joshua Han, the representative of MEDAIR Korea, as well as our distinguished speakers, Garrett Hughes, International Program Director at MEDAIR, and Damon Ellsworth, Humanitarian Research and Development Specialist at MEDAIR.
Professor Kang, thank you so much for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Johnson Joshua, representing MEDAIR in Korea, managing this affiliate office for the last 3 years. I'd like to take this opportunity to express our huge thanks to Yonsei University IGEE for inviting MEDAIR and speaking at this prestigious forum. So MEDAIR is a Swiss-based Christian humanitarian organization committed to humanitarian principles, irrespective of race, religion, or creed. So serving 45 countries over the last 35 years, MEDAIR has been at the forefront of a life-saving mission in emergency health, supporting the most vulnerable, like women and children and refugees. So given a limited time frame, let me take just a few minutes of your time by introducing briefly to my respected colleagues here from MEDAIR International, who have dedicated many years to this life-saving mission. First, Mr. Garrett Hughes. Garrett has worked for the last 6 years, International Program Director at MEDAIR, previously as a head of country program. And before joining MEDAIR, Garrett has spent 15 years working with the various international humanitarian organizations, including Merlin, Medical Emergency Relief International, and Tearfund UK, and Dutch-based JOA, in very many fragile contexts around the globe, and on emergency response teams in such countries as South Sudan and Myanmar. Before all this, he spent 5 years working for the British government as the advisor to Prime Minister, where he coordinated strategy priorities on international development, foreign policy across government departments. Garrett holds a postgraduate degree of management science in international development and globalization from the University of London. And next is Damon Ellsworth. Damon started his career as a volunteer with MEDAIR in South Sudan in 2010 and served MEDAIR for the last 15 years as a chartered civil engineer. Damon dedicated his professional life to the humanitarian sector, working in some of the most complex and challenging environments. So among many others, Damon played a pivotal role in designing and building the infrastructure of the world's largest refugee camp in response to a Rohingya refugee crisis in Bangladesh in 2017. So MEDAIR's response to the Tigray conflict in Ethiopia in 2021, and the Ukraine conflict in 2022. Last year, 2 years ago in 2023, he spearheaded emergency response efforts for the devastating earthquakes in Turkey. So most recently, last year, Damon set up vital programs in Kenya, so further demonstrating his continuous commitment to humanitarian aid sector. His key approach has been designing the right-sized community, the engagement strategy for MEDAIR emergency teams. So these aspects, I believe, should give us insightful info to discussion this afternoon. So now I hand over to my colleagues from Lausanne, Switzerland, to discuss about the main subject, very, very timely and in line with the theme of the GEEF to 2025. So I do appreciate your continuous attention today's presentation and encourage your active participation in Q&A session later on as well. So thank you, and please welcome our media team.
Thank you, Joshua, and thank you everyone for joining this session. I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you very much for giving me your time to let us share with you this afternoon. Yesterday, we heard from many distinguished elder statesmen, and we also heard the voice of many youth and young people. I think it's fair to say that I can no longer represent the youth anymore. So I'm maybe bridging the gap between the youth voice and the elder statesman voice, and I'm somewhere in between, bridging the divide between the generations, perhaps. So, as Joshua shared, I'm the International Programs Director for MEDE. I've been working for them for the last 5 years, and way before that, in my early career, I worked for the UK government, where I was an advisor for the Prime Minister of the UK, and I was advising him on policy related to development topics and also Africa. And early on, I made that decision that I wanted to give up that position and go and volunteer overseas. And so me and my wife, who is a doctor, we decided to volunteer to go to South Sudan and support some of the health and nutrition programs that were running in South Sudan. So that was now 16 years ago, and since then I've continued to work for different international NGOs. So this afternoon I want to spend a little bit of time just reflecting on the current context that we find ourselves in globally. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the topic of community engagement and how, if done well, can really bridge the divides that exist in different communities and between different generations, and give actual concrete examples of where MEDE's work has helped to bring about that change in several different examples. And then I will hand over to my colleague Damon, who will share some of his experiences from Ukraine. And also we have an innovative idea around using artificial intelligence for the purpose of community engagement that we would like to share with you and give you some insights into. So firstly, the events of the last couple of weeks, I think it's fair to say, have shaken many people in the development and humanitarian sectors. There has been a massive change in the global context. So we've experienced for the last maybe 30 years, a growing spirit of global collaboration, the value of multilateral organizations, and working together and to tackle the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've probably seen a growing trend in the last few months and weeks that some of those principles, some of those values are being questioned. Even the relevance of continuing to pursue emergency life-saving action, the purpose of why it is a global responsibility to try and bring about the Sustainable Development Goals is really being questioned on a global scale at the moment, which is ever more important why we need events like this one to continue to advocate for the importance of global cooperation and taking action towards the SDGs. The second big change we've probably seen in the last couple of weeks is the global funding environment. We have seen in many countries in Europe, so if I think about my home country, the UK, other countries such as the Netherlands and Switzerland, and also the United States, we have seen that there's been huge reductions to the budgets that are available for humanitarian and development activity. And we are no longer in the position to be so well funded globally. So this is a huge shift, a huge challenge that we are all facing in the community at the moment. The third challenge that we are faced with currently, and we spend some time exploring this week, is also climate change. So we are seeing the effects of climate change where we are experiencing more frequent disasters. They are coming more frequently. They're becoming deeper emergencies, and they are stacking on top of each other, meaning that the most vulnerable countries and people, populations, are disproportionately affected by the disasters that are caused by climate change. So for some of our country programs, to give an example that we were discussing over lunch, in South Sudan, in one of our field locations, in the last few months, they've experienced flooding caused by heavy rain, which has caused people's houses and homes to be flooded. A few weeks later, they experienced a cholera outbreak in the same villages. And so we have patients receiving treatment on the floor of medical centers because there is not the proper facilities to support them in the cholera outbreak. And now, with just in a few months of there being flooding, there is also now a predicted drought in South Sudan. And so there will be challenges to provide crops and to grow food, so that people will be short of food and go hungry, causing malnutrition. So even in the space of a few months, we can see that one vulnerable population in South Sudan has been affected by 3 different separate disasters, which are all adding to the strain that those people are experiencing. And then the SDGs. We know in the last report to the UN General Assembly, the report said that only 17% of the SDGs were on track to be achieved, and nearly half of them were showing minimal support or minimal progress, and over 1/3 had stalled or even gone backwards over the last couple of years. So that's a pretty intimidating context that we face. Huge needs, huge climatic changes, which mean that disasters are happening more frequently. The most vulnerable, the most fragile countries heavily affected by climate change, and the level of funding being available massively decreasing. And it's with that context that we bring and talk about the topic of community engagement. Just to give you a little bit of background about MEDAIR and who we are as an organization. So as my colleague Joshua said, we have an office here in Korea, but we're an international organization. We work in, at the moment, 13 different country programs globally. And if you look at the map on the screen, the ones in the light green color, that's where we are currently working. And you can see that they are the most difficult, fragile, hard to reach, insecure countries. And not only does MEDAIR work in those, we specifically target them. We say, actually, we want to find the most vulnerable. We want to find those communities that have been forgotten about, those communities that don't have a voice, those communities that aren't covered in international media. And we want to be there to come alongside those communities and support them and help them in their response to their emergency. And so that's why we work in the most vulnerable countries. There is a categorization that ranks every country in the world by how vulnerable their population is. And that's called the Inform Risk Index. And MEDAIR is working in 7 of the top 10 most vulnerable and fragile countries globally. And that's really where we see our mandate and see our passion for the work that we do to represent the most needy and the most vulnerable. Just in 2023, we were able to directly help and assist 3.6 million people across the globe. And we work in the areas of health and nutrition. And within that, we also include mental health and psychosocial support, which is very important in the conflict situations and other disaster areas where we work. We respond to the need for water, so people have drinking water to drink, but also clean latrines and sanitation, and hygiene, all with the aim of reducing the outbreaks of diseases in those communities. We also work on shelter and reconstruction. So in different contexts, we will build transitional shelters, or we will repair people's apartments or houses. And I've got some examples to share of that this afternoon. And then we also do cash assistance. So in many contexts today, the needs of the people can vary from one household to the next household. One family may need support to provide money for buying medicines. Another one may have medicines, but they need heating, so they would rather buy a heater. And so providing cash grants, cash assistance, it gives dignity to the people, so they are able to choose what support they need and be able to use the money that we provide to buy the assistance and the support that they need. And so the cash assistance is a growing area of the work for MEDAIR. And so the topic that I want to really focus on this afternoon and give some examples is that of community engagement. In April 2021, the former UN Secretary General and Emergency Relief Coordinator, his name was Mark Lowcock, he stated that one of the biggest failings of the humanitarian system is that the agencies do not pay enough attention to the voices of the people caught up in crises. He said the humanitarian system is set up to give people in need what international agencies and donors think they need and what they have to offer. Rather, they should be listening to the people and give what they themselves think that they need most. And so I want to emphasize just how important that MEDAIR sees community engagement. It acts as a multiplying effect, particularly at this moment where the global funding is being reduced. We need to be able to do more with less money. And community engagement is a clear way to multiply the impact and the resources that we have. It allows us to bridge divides. The topic for this whole conference and forum of bridging divides. And when we do good community engagement, we listen to the communities, we understand their perspectives, we understand how they see their problems, and allow them to come up with solutions as well, and help design the projects that we run. It really allows for a more sustainable impact and greater social community cohesion between the different people groups in the communities where we work. When we really listen to the needs of the people, we also provide assistance which is relevant to them. There is no point handing out heaters or blankets to a community when it's 45 degrees outside. So we want to make sure that we are providing the right support to the right people when they need it. So listening to their needs and understanding how we can give them the best assistance, making it really relevant to the needs that they have. And then finally, it creates local ownership. We are an international organization. It's not our crisis. It's really the crisis of the population and the people that are affected. It's their crisis. And we want to come alongside them and assist them in that. But we also want to bolster the efforts that they are making, the capabilities, the skills, the knowledge that they have. And we come alongside to maximize that. But we don't want to undermine it. We don't want to set up something which is unsustainable in the long term. So we really need to make sure that the activities we do are closely aligned. So in the statement on the screen, that community engagement is the bridge that connects divided communities. It transcends ethnic and generational divides. And by listening and involving members of the community, we can create sustainable change that unite us in shared humanity. And so I'd like to take the opportunity now just to give a few examples of where I've seen that in practice. So one of the great things that I enjoy about my job is being able to travel the world and being able to go and be a witness to the crises and the disasters that people are experiencing, and seeing the resilience of people. When we talk about shared humanity, the fact that people are dignified, doesn't matter what context they're living in, what country they're living in, what religious background, what ethnicity they have a dignity. And we need to recognize their dignity, and we need to come alongside them and see how our projects are able to bolster and recognize their dignity. The first example I want to share is with programming in Madagascar. So back in 2021, there was the biggest drought in Madagascar for 40 years. Linked to climate change, areas which previously had had a lot of rain, and there was a lot of agricultural production and crops grown. Suddenly, there was a drought for several seasons in a row, and they were no longer able to provide food by growing crops. Also, the water points that they were used to using were drying up, so they didn't have access to water. And of course, if you don't have access to food, you don't have access to water, you quickly have outbreaks of diseases, and that has an impact on particularly on the most vulnerable, so the elderly, the children under the age of 5, and women that are pregnant and expecting to give birth. And so in this picture here, you can see we are treating children for malnutrition. We are screening them to see whether they're underweight. We're providing them with different medicines. You can see them laid out on the table. It's very simple. It's not very expensive, but it provides life-saving care to keep babies alive when ordinarily they would die through malnutrition. And when we went to this community, we drove around to a lot of the villages and the communities in the area, and we saw water points that had been destroyed and vandalized. And this made no sense to us. You know, why, if people are desperate to have clean drinking water, why are these water points destroyed? Why have they been vandalized? They've been knocked over. Some of them had been set fire to. They had been destroyed. And so in talking to the local communities, we realized that because there was a shortage of water, that the different villages and different community groups were fighting with each other over the water resources that were remaining. So one village would go to the water point in another area and destroy that water point and vandalize it. And looking back, those water points had been built many years ago, not by MEDER, but by another organization. And the local villages and communities had never been consulted on where to put them. So actually, where they had been sited created conflict in those communities. It led to fighting, and it led to dispute as they fought over those resources. And so in this picture here, you can see community engagement, what it looks like. So we had a 2-day conference where we brought all of the elders from the different villages. We brought the women and children as well along to listen to their voices. We heard the different communities in the different villages share their perspective, their understanding of the situation. And we created a physical map of all of the different villages, and we discussed where we should put the new water points. And we kept going until there was consensus and agreement amongst these villages about where the water points should be located. Because we wanted to bridge the divide between these communities. We wanted to take communities that were in tension and conflict and resolve that. And so we were able to do that by good communication, taking the time to listen to people's perspectives, understand where the tensions were, not try and cover them up, but try and find a resolution that people were happy with. And at the end of the project and the end of these consultations, we were able to construct many water points for these villages. And these are just a few examples here of the work we were doing. So to drill boreholes into the ground making sure that we understood the dynamics of the aquifers that need to be recharged under the ground, making sure that we tested the water quality to make sure the water was clean enough to drink. We pumped the water up the ground, sometimes using solar panels to make it more long-lasting. And people were able to have clean water again and able to drink clean water, wash, have good hygiene. And so we saw the amount of nutrition or malnutrition reduced, and we saw babies that were healthier and disease-free when combined with our health programming. So we just saw the effect of how good community engagement bridged those divides between communities that were fighting and in conflict with each other. So if done well, community engagement can overcome those challenges. Next, I want to just give an example of our programming in Jordan. So Jordan is a host country for many, many refugees from Syria that were displaced back in 2011, 2012. Also refugees from Iraq, from Sudan, from other parts of the world flee to Jordan as a safe haven in the Middle East. And this particular photo here is of they're from Syrian refugees that are now living in Jordan. And part of our programming in Jordan is to do psychosocial support, so mental health treatment for refugees that have had to flee from Syria. So a lot of the women and the children had experienced traumatic events due to conflict. And so we try to incorporate not just the physical, but also the mental needs of the populations that we're working with. And so we have different groups. We started with women in particular, where women would come together in peer support groups. So they make friendships with each other, and we then train volunteers, and the volunteers then run through a curriculum which helps the women process the trauma and experiences, and it helps build social connection and social understanding and empathy between communities. Because refugees that have had to flee their country, when they flee, they also lose their family relations, they lose their connections with the people that were in their village or their area previously, and they are uprooted and placed in a new location. And often they do not have the social connections. So as MEDEA, we do these peer support groups where we set up groups and we're working with women to support women to come together on a weekly basis and work through their trauma and their experiences together. And in the course of this work, we also were listening, and we heard that there was a huge problem, not just with the women in the community, but also with the youth. So many children that had fled back in 2011 or 2012, 10 years later, they were still refugees and they were still living in Jordan. But they didn't feel like they belonged in Jordan because they were originally from Syria. They'd spent the majority of their lives living as a refugee in Jordan. The adolescents had now grown up, so they arrived as children, as refugees. They were now teenagers and becoming young adults. But they had experienced more of their time as a refugee living in Jordan than they had of their home location in Syria. And they had very high levels of depression. They didn't have much hope for the future. They didn't feel that they had many career opportunities. They had challenges in going to school. They didn't feel that they'd be able to earn a good livelihood or income in the future because they weren't fully incorporated into the Jordanian civil society and culture. So they thought the only opportunity they had was to work in quite insecure market traders, very informal jobs in Jordan, and that was the future that they experienced. And so after listening to the concerns of the communities, we actually designed a specific mental health program, curriculum, with our specialists and our experts. And we took first of all the caregivers, so the adults and the grandparents and the parents of the children, and we ran sessions amongst that group to help them. We then ran sessions with the adolescents and the teenagers to understand their concerns. And then after several weeks and many sessions together, we then brought those two groups together. So we brought the adolescents and teenagers together alongside the adults and the parents and the caregivers, and held joint sessions. So it helped bridge the divide between those two generations, helped bring understanding, empathy, helped bring stronger social cohesion between the different generations, and allowed this group of adolescents to really have a voice which had been overlooked and hadn't been listened to before. So I share that again as an example where good listening and social engagement, community engagement, allows us to adapt our assistance to the real needs and draw out those voices and those perspectives from those that would ordinarily be overlooked or not listened to. And then my final example before I hand over to my colleague is one from Sudan. So back again in 2021, there was a new conflict in Ethiopia, where up in the north, in the Tigray region, there was an internal conflict. And so again, many hundreds of thousands of refugees fled from Ethiopia across the border into Sudan. And so Medair, we mobilized. Actually, Damon was on the emergency response team and was one of the first person to be on the ground to manage that response. And when we arrived, there were hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands of people that were given locations like the one I'm sharing above to live in. So you can see that they were given a tent to live in. The tent was pretty much in the middle of a desert. There is no trees, there is no shelter. It's a very flat farmland. There was nothing there. All that was there was these tents, and these people were expected to live in this location. And so we quickly realized that the population needed support. This photo was taken at the very beginning of the response, and the tents look very nice, very neat, very tidy, and it's what was needed during the first phase of emergency response. But soon, after 6 months, the tents soon descended into the picture that you can see there on the top left-hand side. The tents started falling down, they started leaking water. The animals, so snakes, scorpions, were coming into the shelters. They were a hazard because of fire, because those tents catch fire very easily. And it wasn't a sustainable solution. So we spoke with the communities, we spoke to the refugees, and we talked to them. We said, well, how can we build you a shelter which will last several years, that will give you more dignity, and it will protect you from the dangers of the wind and the rain, but it will also allow you to have a lock on the door, particularly because we saw the violence against women and children in that camp being a real problem, and people you can't lock a door in a tent. It's impossible. We've tried. So to build them shelters where they have an actual lock on the door, which they could close behind them and give them some kind of protection. So quickly we made a design. We started building demonstrations. That is one of the first prototypes of the shelters that we built. And you can see the contrast between the tent that people were living in and the hut that we build. It may be different to the types of houses that we live in the UK or in Korea, but this was a traditional type of structure that they lived in Ethiopia and in Sudan. And so obviously this design was appropriate to the local setting. It was a design that was well known and was used, and they would know how to repair the roof, for example. If the roof was damaged or if the walls were damaged, they would be able to repair it. And so the expectation that these transition shelters would last for several years and give people dignity for a few years. And On the second version, we realized that actually these locations were going to flood in the rainy season. The water comes up, and if we didn't protect the base of these houses, then the walls would crumble. So then we started experimenting with using bricks so that the water wouldn't be able to penetrate the bottom of the houses and they wouldn't fall down so quickly. So we started using bricks to build the bottom of these tukals, or these mud houses. And we also decided to empower women by setting up female-only working groups. So this is an example here where several women would come together and they would be taught how to do masonry, so how to build the brick houses, how to construct, and it allowed them to earn an income, which then empowered them to have money, and they didn't need to resort to other exploitative livelihoods in order to earn money. They were able to earn their own money and have a trade, which would be beneficial to them in the future. So we worked with these women's groups to design and then build this type of house. And then finally, we thought about the environment, and this type of burnt bricks here, when you harden the bricks by using fire, and to make the fire, you have to burn a lot of wood and a lot of charcoal. So actually, it's really bad for the environment to make these types of bricks. So also, when we talked to the communities again and we thought about it, we decided actually using these bricks wasn't the right thing to do. It wasn't good for the environment. It contributed to climate change, so we didn't want to use them anymore. So then we progressed to the third type of building, which had rocks. And the rocks were quarried from local areas. So they were transported locally. And this was the final design that we used. So to have rocks at the bottom that would stop the water coming in the rainy season. The type of design of the house also kept the heat out in the summer. It was lockable, it provided safety, and we also trained and empowered women to build these houses so that they would have an income and a livelihood for the future. So even in an emergency relief humanitarian project, there are things that we can already do to build sustainability and to make a lasting impact and to listen to the voice of the community. And one other thing that we did is this was a refugee camp, and at the end of the project, we built over nearly 1,000 different houses for refugees. So if you think about approximately 5 people in each house, so the number of people that we were able to assist relatively cheaply, but giving them the safety and dignity that they desired, and we wanted to give them. But not only did we work with the refugees, we also saw that there was tensions between the refugees living in this camp and the host communities. So remember, the refugees are from Ethiopia, they're living in Sudan, and so the local populations in Sudan were also worried about the refugees being there. They were worried that there was more support going to the refugees than there was to their own communities. So rather than just work with the refugees, we also started projects with the host community in their villages, because they were also extremely poor. They were also experienced the flooding during the rainy season. And so we used an approach called participatory risk mapping, where the communities, the villages, sat down and they drew a picture of their village, and they identify all of the risks that they could experience, whether that be conflict, whether that be rainwater, whether that be disease outbreaks. So they mapped their risk, and then we identified the ways that we could support them. And so the main way that we were supporting them is to help them build drainage, so that when the rainy season came, the water was channeled into the local river, and they didn't get flood water, because once you have flood water, that creates standing water, which creates diseases such as cholera, which then also means you have diseases such as malaria because there's more mosquitoes living in the water. So we built them with them, worked with them to build drainage systems in the host villages. And working together, that meant that the divides between the host communities and the refugees were bridged. So there was more social cohesion and less antagonism between those two people groups. So that's another example where using good, constructive dialogue, social engagement, conversations, consultations, and involving the populations in the design and activities that we run, we're able to overcome some of the divides that we experience in the communities where we're working. So I've given you just 3 very quick examples of our work in different countries, and I'm going to hand over to Damon now, who's going to give an example of also one of our most recent disaster response, which is to the Ukraine conflict.
Okay, so it's March 2022. Arrive in Ukraine, there's snow on the ground, and Russia had occupied a big part of the eastern territories in Ukraine, leaving millions of civilians in Russian-occupied territory. We wanted to mobilize a response there after there was a lightning offensive back from Ukraine in July, August time, which recovered parts of their territory, and communities started returning to their homes in October, November, in a place called Kharkiv Oblast. It's in the far east and it borders Russia. And when I arrived in this one community, about 20 kilometers from the contact line in November, again, snow on the ground, we started to learn the situation, how communities had started returning. We learned very quickly that no other NGOs had arrived yet, that the government assistance hadn't yet been extended to this community, and that there were huge needs for health, repair, for shelters, and everything had been damaged or destroyed or taken, and so they really had nothing to get them through the winter, and the community had started returning. The other thing I took away from that assessment was there was a huge division between this community. Those that had left and run away during the occupation were accused of being cowards by those who stayed. And those who stayed were accused of being collaborators by those that left. So we understood there was huge division in this community, enormous need, and there was a need for humanitarian intervention, but there was this enormous division within the community. I knew MEDEC could not do this intervention alone because it was a 5-hour journey by car. When it was accessible at all, the bridges had been blown up. Most of the roads, the smaller roads had been mined, and there was constant sirens. I think in November there was 110 sirens, and we spent more than 100 hours underground from the shelling and the bombs. So, difficult environment to do programming in. And so I knew that we needed the community to take a huge ownership of this project. They would be the ones delivering this. And also knowing we can't be there to mobilize the remote communities in this village, 3,500 households, some of them as close as 5 kilometers from the contact line. You can hear the shells landing. We needed them to lead this response. So I said to them, you need to tell me in 3 days how this can be delivered. If I can provide you with supplies and logistics, this has to be you to do the last mile distribution. This is what we call it, the last mile distribution. So I go away, and we found some very generous supporters through core humanitarian pipelines to provide us with shelter repair kits, hygiene kits, and kitchen sets so that they could cook food for themselves. We found what I think is the only warehouse in that entire area that didn't have a damaged ceiling. Miracle number 3, 4, where are we up to now? And we secured 24 articulated lorries to provide 340 tons of humanitarian aid. And then from that warehouse, we had to mobilize 10 smaller sprinter trucks that could get over pontoon bridges for that last bit to get into this gymnasium of an abandoned school to provide the distribution. when I arrived 3 days later to ask this community how this was going to be distributed, how this was going to be planned, they provided me with the most incredible, comprehensive execution plan I may have ever seen. And they all united behind it. And over the next month, we distributed those supplies to about 12,000 people. Not possible if MEDER did this by themselves. Multiplier to have communities take ownership and lead their response. Not just financial multiplier, but ownership. You know, let's work together on this. It was inspirational. You know, think about your closest friends and communities. You know, my best friend, we agree on everything. You know, we never argue. We're always on the same page. Whenever I ask him to do something, he always says yes. He's always serving me. And we never have tough times at all. You know, it's always an easy life. Said no one ever, right? Our closest friends, our closest communities, are people we were in the trenches with, going through difficult times. And that was resilience. We entered this community through real hardship, and together they came together. They bridged the divide. And that's the example I want to pull out with one last quote. No power for change is greater than a community learning what it cares about. No power for change greater than a community learning what it cares about. Don't you love that? Okay, what's your origin? What is your age? What is your gender? How many female children under 5 do you have? Have you had any acute watery diarrhea in the last 72 hours? Do you have any chronic needs? Are you ill? Will you be able to keep your children safe tonight? Will you be able to feed them tomorrow? These are standard questions that we ask in our surveys to the people we try to serve. We do key informant interviews with community leaders, community representatives, and we also do focus group discussions to validate and verify what we've heard. It's great to see people disagreeing, because then you know you're getting closer to the truth. And we also do household surveys, proportional and representative of the target population. And this is an example of some of the questions that I shared. Usually we mobilize numerators from the local community. We provide them with 2 or 3 hours of training, give them a handset, and we say, okay, we need you to do these surveys for 100, 500 households in this target population. They then go off and start doing that. The survey is about 45 minutes long, maybe an hour. It's about 150 questions, and that's how we do it. These surveys, these questions, who felt those things, those questions, undignified? Who feels they would answer those questions honestly? If you knew the numerator, the person asking the questions, would you maybe lie? You're illiterate. You cannot take the survey offline and do it in isolation. Barriers to good data, and we need good data to provide principled humanitarian action with the limited resources we have. So I'm a chartered civil engineer. I've been working on these emergency responses for the last 4 or 5 years, and 6 months ago I took a new job as head of research and development within MEDER. I say head, it's just me. And about 6 months ago, my CEO comes to me, she says, Damon, I want an example of where AI can enhance our community-led program design. What a great question, AI, yeah? So, I thought this is great. Now in Lebanon, we do about 40,000 household surveys every year, 40,000. Globally, maybe 100,000 different types of surveys. But how powerful would that be if those surveys could be run through an AI? Well, great news is that hot off the press, finished just yesterday, we have a conversational AI survey bot, which I can show you if we've got time. I'm looking at Gareth. But this is an opportunity to scale up our community engagement, because that data, while it is less kind of qualitative, it's absolutely critical to most of our donors to see exact numbers. So I'm going to see if this works in my phone.
am an artificial intelligence system here to help assess the needs of the local population. I will be asking you some questions, and I want to assure you that your responses will be stored securely. Please try to keep your answers to about 1 minute. To start, could to talk in?
I would like to speak in English.
Great. We will continue in English. What is the name you would like me to call you?
Call me Salima. I'm from Sudan, and I've recently been displaced here as a refugee.
Thank you for sharing that with me, Salima. I understand that this must be a challenging time for you. Before we continue, can you please let me know if you are in a safe place to talk?
I think I'm in a safe place to talk. You can go ahead with the next question.
Thank you, Salima. Let's begin with the first section, which is about general information regarding your community. Is it okay if we discuss this section now, or would you prefer to start with another topic?
I don't want to talk about this. I haven't seen my son for 3 days. I've got 2 children. I don't know if I can feed tonight. My neighbor is pregnant, and I haven't been able to find any way to buy my medication. What should I do?
I'm truly sorry to hear about the difficult situation you're facing, Salima. It sounds incredibly challenging, and I can only imagine how worried you must be. While I am here to gather information, I can also try to guide you towards resources that might help. 1. Local support services. Try to reach out to local humanitarian.
I'll pause it there because we can't go on forever. But that's the idea. You get the flavor of where this is headed and the power of that. Not only is this a standard response to gathering information, but it's also an opportunity for them at their speed to talk about what they think is important to them. Most of my key informant interviews go this way, where I say, can you tell me where you're from, where is your origin? And they start talking about their family, they start talking about their medical conditions, they start talking about their children, about how they're disabled, how they don't know where they're going to sleep tonight. Now that's human. That is far more human than going question by question by question, multiple choice. And that really excites me. So I'm going to pause there. Gareth, back to you.
So it's exciting. We can use new technology to actually allow us to collect more information from affected communities. It allows us to analyze that data. So behind this application, there's all the back office analysis that will be crunching the figures and statistics and the data so that we can use that as evidence to then make the best decisions about what activities to prioritize. Do we run a water project? Do we prioritize setting up a health clinic in the neighboring village? Is there security constraints? Are there army personnel that are living down the road? See, all of these sorts of questions which we need to ask to affected populations, but it takes time normally, and it takes a lot of people to go and collect this information. Imagine everybody was able to use their own smartphone to use the app to tell us what their needs were. And then it produces a wonderful report that gives us graphs, it gives us the evidence to then really make the most cost-effective decisions about how we can have the greatest impact as an organization. That is the dream of being able to use technology, but still communicate and hear from local communities. I'm not sure if you said this, Damon, but this will have the capacity to be using multiple languages. And AI is now so good with translation that it can be used for nearly any dialect or language around the world. And that will be the future of using tools such as this. So it's an amazing step forward. So I'm going to just wind up and conclude now and leave time for you to ask any questions that you might have. So we've heard that humanitarian development actors, we have this extraordinary ability to bridge divides. Bridge divides between generations, bridge divides between those that do not normally have a voice and normally get neglected and unheard and not listened to. We have the ability to bridge divides between communities that are in conflict with each other for whatever reasons. That could be because of resources, it could be because of different ethnicities, it could be because of one is a refugee community and one is a host community, and therefore there's tensions between them. And when we do good, strong community discussions, community engagement, and we listen properly, where we have a humble attitude and realize that the populations have so much to offer and we need to build on their skills and their abilities. If we take the time to do that, then we have the ability to bridge and help overcome these divides that we see in many of the communities where we work. The international community at the global level, we're able to speak up for those that are voiceless, to continue to advocate for international humanitarian law, to advocate for principled humanitarian action, to advocate for global cooperation, and give examples from the most voiceless and the most underrepresented, and advocate on their behalf. We're able to bridge the divide between the local populations who are in rural locations in the most fragile, vulnerable, isolated countries, and we're able to bring them the technology that is available in the 21st century and bring them up to date with all of that technical advancement. So there's a huge role that we can play in bridging those divides as we continue to advocate for the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's more important that we do that now more than ever before with the current skepticism that there is around multilateral cooperation and the role of humanitarian and development support around the world. It's more important that we do this now than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Garrett and Damon. Thanks for your great introduction and sharing our the community engagement story very vividly. So it's time's up in 2 minutes, but if you take a few questions from the floor, if any, okay.
Thanks for giving an opportunity to ask a question. My name is Xian from KFHI. As a humanitarian affairs team, we're about to implement a project in Madagascar for a 3-year project funded by COICA for the climate refugees. And one of the issues that we found out was the community was left behind, isolated, vulnerable, because the several international organizations are no longer supporting them because the community tend to consider the grants as natural. I think making them have ownership is one of the important things when we engage the communities. So is there any tips that you can tell us regarding involving and engaging the communities in this, on this? Thank you.
Great example. So we are working in very similar locations as the Korea Food for the Hungry. So, I mean, particularly for that example, where we build and construct water points, then we have to think about how those are going to be maintained and repaired and looked after in the future. So it shouldn't be, if it's an international organization like MEDA that's providing the support, we are not necessarily going to be there in 5 years or 10 years, in 20 years' time. So we need to build up the skill and know-how and the capacity of the local community to be able to repair and be able to buy small parts to replace the bits of the pump or repair the solar panels if we've lost solar panels. So when we do a water point, we're always training the local communities to be able to repair and be able to provide spare parts for the future. That's also built into the project activities. So it's never just that we build it and then we leave and they're left to do that themselves without any knowledge or know-how. In our projects in Madagascar, we're trying to link the water points to the local authorities so that the local Ministry of Water and Irrigation, they also take some ownership and responsibility for repair. And where that's not possible, because some of the places where we work, the local government does not have the resources and is very weak in their ability to manage such things. We can also work with the community to come up with a solution to say that, okay, if every household in this village is benefiting from this water point, then why doesn't every household give $1 per month or $2 per month or whatever might be appropriate? And they put it into a community pot of money. They have a treasurer that looks after that pot of money. And then that can be used over years to buy the spare parts to repair the borehole in the future. So that's one example where you're not only creating an infrastructure like a water point, but you're creating the systems, the structures, and the know-how, how to make the community take responsibility and ownership of it for the future. So that's just one example.
Thank you. We have 2 more minutes. So any other questions? It's back there.
Hi, thank you so much for the incredible presentation. So my question is kind of, Gareth, you touched on this kind of in the introduction of your presentation, but with the changing political climate and the real instability that there is right now in terms of humanitarian funding, how are you as MEDAIR, and how are humanitarian agencies communicating that with the communities in a way that still preserves your relationship with the community and helps them still feel like they have agency and power over and independence over their communities while you're having these, I'm sure, very difficult conversations and letting them know that funding is at the very least unstable. Thank you.
What a fantastic question. It's difficult moments. We as MEDAIR are reviewing all of our current projects. We are refocusing on the most critical life-saving activities. So we have our technical experts in WASH and health, nutrition and mental health, in shelter and infrastructure. And we've asked our technical advisors to narrow down the list of activities to only the most life-saving critical activities, and that we are prioritizing doing those activities. Now, obviously, in some communities, that does mean that we're having to stop activities. And so, how do we share that with the communities where we're working? So I think it's a lot about being open and being transparent. And probably the worst thing that you can do is make promises that you can't keep. So we have to be very real and say, look, we don't know right now whether we'll be able to continue this activity in the longer term. We're going to have to pause it for the interim, for the moment. We're waiting for more information from our different supporters. And we will give you regular updates and come back with information about if and when the activities will restart. And maybe say, look, we're going to focus on just the most life-saving priorities, and then actually speak to them, from your perspective, what are the most life-saving activities that we do in your communities? What things can you simply not do without? Where do you see your children dying or your children struggling with disease outbreaks? What would you like us as MEDAIR to continue to prioritize? And then we take that perspective and that input, and we triangulate it with our technical advisors to make the best decisions about what to keep doing. And then just try and have lots of community meetings, speak to the elders, have women's groups, have different open town hall conversations to share the developments and the updates with them.
So apology for last time to to ask a question. His time's up. So thank you so much for your this special attention, interest, and active participation on our meta mission. We'd like to ask you ongoing prayer concern and standing with your prayers and the people who definitely need their humanitarian assistance. More than 300 million people in every second. Thank you for your attention, and God bless you.
Thank you, speakers, for that enlightening discussion and for emphasizing the power of community-driven solutions in crisis situations. We'll now take a short break before the next session, which will be moderated by Professor Ki-Hun Lee. Thank you.